This video presentation is for Chapter 16 of the Criminological Theory textbook. We're going to talk about developmental criminology and what we call LifeCourse theories. One of the most enduring findings of criminology is what we call the age crime curve, and this is simply the finding that criminal involvement, juvenile delinquency increased dramatically from the age of about 7 up until 17, and then it declines pretty sharply. And as people enter adulthood, they dramatically reduce their delinquency or criminal involvement. So if you were to draw this out on a graph, what you would see starting at age 0 is a line that goes up very quickly as criminal involvement increased. Then at about age 17, you kind of come to a peak, and then it drops off very sharply, and then it tapers out back towards 0 over the course of a person's lifetime. And trying to explain this finding is something that's actually been pretty puzzling to criminologists for quite some time, because we can say for certainty that this relationship exists. But why people desist after a certain age and why it increases at the younger age are questions that are not actually as easy to answer as you would think. There are two types of research you can do. You can do cross-sectional research, which just is kind of a snapshot of someone in time, or you can do what we call longitudinal research, which is examining a person's behavior over a long period of time and looking at repeated observations. And when we look at this kind of research, you can see very clearly this relationship that we talked about the age crime curve. And the emergence of what we call criminal careers is something that some researchers have found interesting. And this is just looking at, when does it start, how long does it last, and then when does it stop. When we look at what we call LifeCourse Criminology, we're really examining two key concepts, and one is continuity and the other is stability in antisocial behavior. And these concepts really are not that difficult. They're pretty much just what they say. We're looking at why does criminal behavior continue for some people, and why does it stay stable, and why does it change for other people. And what we look at also with LifeCourse Criminology is going back to someone's childhood, because what happens during someone's childhood is going to be related to their delinquency during adolescence, and then adolescence usually relates in some way to adulthood. So if the roots of crime lie in childhood, which is what LifeCourse theory really would say most of the time, then a lot of our theories of delinquency must be at least partially right, even though none of them are 100% right. They have identified some important factors that we need to examine. Now keep in mind, when we talk about LifeCourse criminology or LifeCourse theory, it's kind of like saying biological theory. There is no one LifeCourse theory. There are several, and LifeCourse is just one kind of category of theory. I'm going to talk about some of the more famous and well-known ones in this video lecture, but your book will kind of walk you through some others that have some prominence as well. But one of the things you see a lot in this area of LifeCourse theory is what we call integrated theory. And this is where people kind of take pieces of different theories and kind of smush them together and create a new theory that they think will explain things a little better. There are good things about that, but there are also some problems with that. You have to be careful of how you do it. But these integrated theories are somewhat common in the LifeCourse arena. One of the advantages of an integrated theory is that they're not really constrained to any one view of the world. They can incorporate different views from different places. But again, a shortcoming of that approach is that, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, theories tend to have different assumptions about human behavior, different views of our human nature, and they also ask different questions and make different predictions. And so if you just kind of smash two theories together to create a new theory, you may end up with kind of a sloppy theory that doesn't really do what it needs to do. Another problem some people highlight with integrated theory is that some criminologists just assume that by integrating theories we will improve our knowledge. That's not necessarily true. It's not really ever been shown yet that integrated theories are significantly better than the non-integrated theories. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it, but we can't just assume that an integrated theory is better than the two or more theories that make up the new theory. So going back to this issue of continuity and change, these are what we look at in LifeCourse Criminology. Scholars have observed that criminal behavior can be pretty stable, without a lot of change, or it can change a lot. Again, think of the age crime curve. For a lot of people, criminal involvement can increase a lot, and then it can decrease, on the other side. And so there's definitely, some continuity there during different periods of someone's life, but if you look at their entire lifespan, we can usually see a lot of change. There are four general types of LifeCourse theories, and if you look in your book at table 15.1, it will outline this. But there are some theories that argue that there is only continuity in offending, that whatever level of offending people engage in, it never changes. There are other theories that will say offending is marked by either continuity or change. It could be either one, but not both. So either your offending is continuous or it changes, but one of the two. And then there are theories that would also say that offending is marked by continuity and change. That we have periods of continuity, but there can also be change. And then there are theories that focus mainly just on changes that occur. Not that they say there is no continuity, but the focal point of the theory is what causes offending to change. There's a lot of controversy about whether this idea of continuity and or change is part of a developmental process. In Moffat's theory, she outlines how it occurs in very predictable stages. If you look at Sampson and Lobb's theory that we'll talk about in a minute, this continuity and change is very unpredictable. So some theories, will argue that it's kind of a predictable process. It's just part of a natural, developmental process, and other theories will say no, it's not. We can't really predict it at all. If we go back to Gottfredson and Hershey's low self-control theory, they argued that children who have conduct problems early in life are the same ones who manifest delinquency during their teenage years. And they said that the cause of this was low self-control, and the cause of low self-control was ineffective parenting. And so essentially what they were proposing, if you look at it from a LifeCourse perspective, is a theory of continuity in offending with differences in self-control being the main determinant of this stability from childhood to adulthood. So, in other words, they argued that your level of self-control was kind of set early in life, and whatever level of offending you engaged in early in life was pretty much going to stick with you through all your life. And so it really was kind of a theory of continuity. One of the issues with this argument that Gottfredson and Hershey made, though, is whether or not low self-control really is the difference that accounts for continuity and misconduct. There might be other reasons that people persist in misconduct, but their argument is that low self-control was the key construct that mattered. And a lot of research has supported that it is important, but research has also shown pretty emphatically that it's not the only thing that matters, but it is a pretty important factor. And so if you just take their theory on its own, it's a pretty simple theory, which is actually good because simple theories are easy to understand, and it keeps the complexity to a minimum. But it also tends to ignore the reality that there are other factors going on that cause continuity in offending. Now, this concept might be a little bit more difficult to grasp, but Goffreton and Hershey allow for intra-individual change, meaning change that occurs within an individual over time. So they essentially agree with the age crime curve by saying that yes, a person's level of offending will change over time. But what they argue for is stability in inter-individual differences in self-control and participating in offending and other deviant behaviors. So, we're trying to explain this in a way that makes sense. Let's say that you were identified as being someone with low self-control, and we're comparing you to a friend who has high self-control. Well, Goffreton and Hershey would say even the person with low self-control will have changes in their level of offending over their life course. They will offend more as juveniles than they will as adults, and so those relationships exist. But what they would say is that regardless of at what point in your life you're in, the low self-control person will always offend at a higher rate than the high self-control person. So if we're comparing a low self-control person and a high self-control person, they will both probably exhibit the same tendency over their lifetime to offend more as teenagers and then decrease as adults. But the low self-control person will always be offending at a higher rate than the high self-control person will be. So that's their explanation, of continuity and change in their theory, because you really have to account for continuity and change in any theory, because these are things that have been shown to exist across such large percentages of the population. One of the theories I'll mention briefly here is Patterson's social interactional developmental model. And here he talks about early onset of delinquency, and early onset of delinquency, and we're talking about at a very young age. Like when you see children that exhibit antisocial behavior at 5, 6, 7 years old, these usually are kids that are at the highest risk for having really high levels of criminal behavior as they go through their life. And a lot of theories in LifeCourse identify the family as being one of the most important institutions in terms of kind of setting kids on either a good path or a not so good path. But Patterson talked about 3 factors that can disrupt family management. One is if you have parents who are antisocial, they usually use pretty ineffective discipline practices with their own children, so it kind of perpetuates the problem that antisocial parents tend to produce antisocial children. Social disadvantage seems to be more related to physical and authoritarian parenting styles. And when we say authoritarian parenting, what that usually means is kind of think of like a military type of approach where you just order your kids around, you're pretty harsh with them, and there's not really a lot of emotional connection between the parent or child. That's an authoritarian parenting style. Harsh physical discipline is also associated with some pretty negative outcomes for children. The third one there, when families experience high levels of stress, parental management just becomes more difficult. Think about when families are, losing a job, or they're moving, or there's a death in the family, or something like that. That kind of disrupts, the management of the family. And if these kind of things go on for long periods of time, I mean, think about families who are perpetually moving because they can't ever hold a job down for more than a year. Those kinds of family environments can produce some problems that will affect children and how they turn out later. One of the most well-known LifeCourse theories is Terry Moffat's LifeCourse Theory. And this is the theory that talks about adolescent persistent offenders, or what they call life course persistence, and adolescent limited offenders. And what she argued is that offending is marked either by continuity or change, but not both. And what she put forth is that there are really two distinct groups of offenders. One was what she called the life course persistent offenders, and these are kids that start offending early and just have high rates of offending all through their life. So these are kids whose lives are marked by continuity of offending because they offend at high rates over their entire life course. And she argued that this makes up about 5 to 10% of the male population. The second group that she argued is that there are what we call adolescent limited offenders. And these are kids who kind of do the typical juvenile dumb stuff when they're young. They participate in some antisocial and delinquent behavior, but then as they get older, they kind of age out of it and they become normal, productive adults. And so these are the people whose offending is marked by change because it, again, escalates as they get older, and then as it escalates up to about age 17, and as they get older beyond that, it tapers off, basically down to almost zero. So, these are the ones that have their offending marked by change, and this is one of the most well-known, and it's a heavily researched theory. And again, her argument was that offenders could, and again, this is a theory of juvenile delinquency, really. That juvenile offenders could be divided into these two groups. So just to summarize a little bit more what I said on the last slide, the life course persistent offenders are the high rate chronic offenders. And this really was kind of a biological theory in some respects, even though I'm not sure if she had a lot of research to back this idea up originally. I mean, there was some. But she essentially argued that these life course persistent offenders had neuropsychological deficits, and that it was those neuropsychological deficits interacting with a negative social environment that caused them to become these life course persistent offenders. And the adolescent limited offenders were the ones who just kind of went in and out of criminal behavior that basically had normal neuropsychological profiles. So that was one of the key differences in Moffat's theory between these two groups, is that she argued that these life course persistent offenders had some kind of biological deficit, whereas the other group did not. So continuity in offending is really the mark of the life course persistent offender, and they were hypothesized to essentially offend at high rates throughout their entire life. And the neuropsychological deficits that Moffat highlighted are the ones that affected verbal development and executive functions. And again, this is the part of the brain that affects decision making, risk assessment, and those kinds of things. The idea of cumulative continuity came about, and there are these three considerations that Moffat highlighted. Life course persistent offenders have a restricted behavioral repertoire, and all she really meant by that was there just aren't really there aren't that many things they know how to do, and so delinquent behavior just kind of becomes something that they fall into. When that happens, you become ensnared by the consequences of that antisocial behavior. Maybe you get picked up by the police, you get brought into juvenile court, you're put on juvenile probation, and it becomes this whole cycle that you kind of get trapped in that's very difficult to get out of. And then those who persist in offending beyond childhood into adulthood experience those same kind of negative outcomes that kind of trap them in it, for their lifetime, really. And so this is what this concept is of cumulative continuity, that there are negative disadvantages that kind of pile up on people over time that makes it very difficult for them to get out of this cycle even if they want to. In looking at the adolescent limited group, the key thing that Moffat talked about here is that, again, trying to explain why they get involved in crime, is because of what she called the maturity gap. And essentially what she meant by that is that as adolescents start to get older, they get close to adulthood, but they're not really adults yet. And adults usually tend to remind them frequently that they're not adults yet. And so they become dissatisfied with this role that they have, where they're close to adulthood, but they're not really adults. They can't do the things that adults do. But they're trying to break out of this role of being a child. And so the antisocial acts they engage in are really kind of aimed at demonstrating that they have autonomous ability to do whatever they want to do. And that's how she explains why adolescent limited offenders do the things they do. And so as they get older and actually become adults, then they don't need to do those antisocial things anymore. Because they no longer have a need to demonstrate, their autonomy in that way. One of the things Moffat talks about as well is that, the adolescent limited offenders usually are not kids that are prone to this kind of behavior necessarily on their own. And a lot of it is learned through mimicking the LifeCourse persistent offenders. They see what those kids are doing, and so they kind of copy them. So you kind of see some influences here of maybe social learning or differential association kind of coming into her explanation of how these kids do what they do. The vast majority of adolescent limited offenders do not persist in offending once they enter adulthood. Their motivation for that kind of thing declines. They, take on other responsibilities. They maybe get jobs, go to college, those kinds of things, and so they just kind of leave that kind of behavior behind. But one of the things to keep in mind, just as LifeCourse persistent offenders kind of become ensnared in this behavior through this idea of cumulative continuity, the same thing can happen to adolescent limited types of kids. Because engaging in this behavior may ensnare them in the system as well. And even though it's not really where they wanted to end up, it might just become a cycle they get into and can't really get out of. There are a couple of key criticisms of Moffat's theory. Of course, the first criticism is, can we really just divide offenders into these two neat little groups and say that encompasses all offenders? The answer to that question is probably no, but it actually does kind of work on one level, just to kind of understand maybe why different groups of kids act the way they do. But some scholars have argued that these two groups are just kind of invented, that you can take any data set of offenders and you can pick an artificial cutoff point in your data, and you can just kind of draw a line and say, okay, well, everybody up here is the LifeCourse persistence and everybody down here is the adolescent limited. So there is some artificiality that comes along with this process. Some people have tried to argue, well, there aren't two groups, we could really divide them into 3 or 4, or some even say 5. The problem with doing that is the more groups you create, the less meaningful those groups become. Because I mean, we could take any group of people and subdivide them into any number of groups, and we could make it work. So the idea of having two groups is attractive because it makes it simple, and the division would seem to be a pretty meaningful one. But if we try to start adding more and more groups, that's problematic, and Moffat has resisted that as a way to improve her theory. But all of that said, there actually is a lot of evidence in the research supporting many of the points of her theory. Again, this idea of having two groups of neatly categorized offenders is probably the most problematic aspect of it. Okay, moving on from Moffat, probably another of the most well-known and well-researched LifeCourse theories is Sampson and Loeb's social bond theory, or it's usually referred to as age-graded informal social control or age-graded social bonding theory. You see a couple different terms thrown around. But this theory really talks about, the whole theme of this theory is continuity and change, that there can be both, that you have periods of life where your offending is at a pretty consistent level, but then something happens in your life to make that change, and you may change either upward or downward, but you kind of get this new level of continuity that continues from that change point. So one of the things they talk about quite a bit is what we call social capital, which really is just the ability of people to have quality relationships in society. And as bonds between people strengthen, or even between society and institutions, a person's social capital increases, and as your social capital increases, they argue that crime just becomes too costly to commit because you have too much to lose by engaging in that sort of behavior. So again, this theory argues that offending is characterized by both continuity and change, and this is again looking at someone's offending over their entire life course. They would pretty much deny, in fact, this theory really runs almost exactly the opposite of what Moffat said. Sampson and Loeb would completely disagree with the idea that there's some group out there that continuously offends and never changes. That would run completely contrary to what their theory originally argues. There was a revision that they made to their theory about 10 years after they originally proposed it, and they expanded their analysis into the process that we call desistance, which is just again talking about why do people stop committing crime when they have been offending at a high rate. And really what they found is that it was the convergence of several factors, and including kind of an allowance for human agency, the fact that we have the ability to make our own decisions and kind of move at our own free will through the world. They started to factor that in as well. So much like Moffat's theory and several others, Sampson and Loeb argue that one of the most important influences on a child is the family early in life. And it's that institution that really kind of shapes where they're headed, at least in their initial stages. And what they also looked at is this idea of strong continuity in antisocial behavior that goes from childhood through adulthood across a variety of life domains. And so it's this idea of cumulative continuity, that there can be just many kind of things that pile up on someone that cause them to be one of these high rate offenders from childhood all the way through adulthood. one of the key things about this age-graded theory is what Sampson and Lobb called turning points. And if someone creates a meaningful social bond during adulthood, that social bond can function as what they call a turning point that would lead someone away from crime and into conformity. And so you can kind of see how they're drawing here on Hershey's original social bond theory to kind of explain, some of this thing that's going on in their theory. But again, these turning points can be positive or negative. Traditionally, marriage was seen as a positive turning point, particularly for men. That if males got married and they were in a life of crime, that marriage would tend to bring them out of that. Well, you have to look at it a little more deeply, though, because if someone who's antisocial marries an antisocial woman, they might be twice as bad together than they were apart. So it could also be a negative turning point that makes things worse. But traditionally, things like getting a job, joining the military, getting married, having children, those were all seen as generally as turning points that would cause someone to desist from crime. Sampson and Lobb based their theory on some data from some researchers named the Glukes. The Glukes were a husband and wife team that worked at Harvard, and Sampson and Lobb just kind of found this data sitting in a basement somewhere from the 1940s or 50s, and they put it all together and used it to test their theory. And it was actually pretty effective, but the Glukes study was a study of 500 delinquent and 500 non-delinquent boys, so there were no girls in their sample. So that really their test only tested the theory for males. But they actually found some pretty good support for their theory using this data set that they reconstructed. There have been a couple of challenges to this theory that Sampson and Lobb came up with. And again, just to kind of summarize this theory, essentially their argument is that as we move through life, we encounter turning points that make us either commit more crime or less crime. And so there are periods of our life that are kind of, demarcated by these turning points. But in between the turning points, our offending is pretty much, characterized by continuity, but then these turning points are what cause the change. But by kind of embracing this idea of social bonds, they've kind of reduced their theory to this idea of social control that Hershey originally talked about in his original social bond theory. So it could just be that what all they're really talking about is differential association or social learning to some extent. But this theory that Sampson and Lobb came up with is also kind of in competition with the theory of low self-control, because self-control theory, again, pretty much argues that whatever level of offending you engage in is going to persist throughout your entire life, and you can't change it. Sampson and Lobb essentially say, well, it changes all the time. So there might not really be a good way to reconcile those. And the reason that's important is because self-control has been shown to be a very important predictor of criminal involvement and juvenile delinquency. So figuring out a way to reconcile self-control with that theory is actually pretty important from a research perspective. Another kind of criticism of this theory, and I don't know if the book mentions it or not, is that Sampson and Lobb's theory is not really very good for prediction. It's really only good looking back. We can look back over a person's life and say, oh yeah, well here's a turning point and here's where they changed. But that doesn't really help us predict how to help someone in the future, because we can't create artificial turning points in people's lives. So from a policy perspective, it's also kind of difficult to say, what types of policy implications would come out of this theory. Sampson and Lobb wrote a book called Shared Beginnings, Divergent Lives in 2003. where they actually extended the Gluck's data set, and what they did is they tried to go back and track down all of these boys from the Gluck's data set from the 1950s, and they figured that they would all have been in their 60s and 70s by the time they found them, and they actually found a pretty good number of them, surprisingly enough, and they kind of did interviews with these men and kind of tracked them until age 70. And gathered a lot more information that kind of helped contribute to this LifeCourse Theory idea. But there were really two key findings they came out with from extending this original data set. One is that it appears that desistance from crime is almost universal. Even people, and keep in mind that the Gluck's data set had some boys in it that were really, really bad offenders, and others that were just kind of non-offenders, didn't really have any problems. Even among the really high-rate offenders, eventually they give it up, almost universally. There's always going to be those few that persist, but what Sampson and Lobb said is that desistance appears to be almost universal. So this idea that there are people out there who just offend at high rates forever is probably not really accurate, or at least it doesn't characterize very many people. But the other thing they found is really difficult to predict when desistance will occur. I mean, there's no one thing that predicted when desistance would occur. Probably the best predictor we have is age, but beyond that, they really didn't find any one thing. There was no one turning point that caused people to desist. I mean, different things would cause different people to desist at different times. So these findings of Sampson and Lobb from extending the Gluck's data set really challenge Moffat's views that LifeCourse persistent offenders, if there is such a thing, don't persist in offending forever. Desistance usually happens for everyone at some point. And desistance is not just part of some neatly unfolding developmental sequence. Remember, that was one of the things from Moffat's theory, is wondering, well, is this just kind of a developmental process? Sampson and Lobb would argue that no, it's not, because if it were, we would see it work pretty much the same for everybody over their life course, and we don't. It works very differently for different people over their life course. So looking at this idea of desistance, and this is an area of research that's not brand new, but it's probably not as well developed as some other areas of criminology. But there are 5 aspects that we can look at when we look at this process of desistance, because this is really what we want to know, right? What will make people stop committing crime? Knowing why they do it is interesting, but we have to keep in mind also that what will make them stop is a very different question than what, because you can't just assume that, because we know why they do it, that we know the answer to what will make them stop. It's really a different question. So again, these structural turning points can set the stage for change, and that was something highlighted in Sampson and Lobb's theory. But these structural events can create social bonds that increase informal social control. Again, think of like marriage. And again, we'll just use the example of a man, say a criminal man getting married to a woman who's not so criminal. All of a sudden there's a level of informal social control that exists between a husband and a wife. If he wants to keep his wife for a very long period of time, he will probably succumb to it. And so these turning points can have events surrounding them that create stronger social bonds. Number 3 there, as offenders move into marriages and jobs, their daily routine activities change to structured and filled with pro-social responsibilities. So we kind of, drawing in this routine activities idea in this theory as well. When we look at desistance, because again, if you're just a delinquent at home and you have nothing to do and you're just hanging out with friends all day, that's kind of a recipe for trouble. But if you get married and you have a job and you have to go to work and maybe go to school and your day is kind of structured, that change in routine kind of changes the level of criminal involvement you're going to have. This if people get into one of these pro-social lifestyles, really desistance just kind of happens by default. I mean, it's not something they have to think about. They just don't have time to do anything else. But the desistance process, as described by Sampson and Law, doesn't really fully determine the choices offenders make. There's still human agency, and people can decide to do whatever they want to do, even if they're in a pro-social lifestyle. People can still decide to do something stupid. But again, you have to take that into consideration as well. One researcher who has done a great deal of work in the area of desistance is name is Maruna, Chad Maruna. And he was interested in why some offenders had desisted from crime where others had not. And what he found, and again, he wrote an entire book devoted to a research project he did on this, but he found that desisters and persisters differed in their cognitive understandings of their lives in crime, the way that they viewed this part of their life. And one of the things he found is what he called condemnation scripts, and this is a name he gave this. But condemnation scripts are the kinds of things that people would tell themselves where they kind of doomed themselves to just a life of crime and there wasn't anything they could do about it. People would say things, because he did a lot of interviews with offenders and talked to them about why they are the way they are and why they do what they do. And people would say things like, this is just who I am, this is what I've always been, and it's what I'll always be. Well, that's a condemnation script. Someone who's just kind of doomed themselves to a life of deviance. On the other hand, Maruna found that some people who had desisted from crime used what he called redemption scripts. And people who had desisted from crime, because again, keep in mind, people who were criminals at one time in their life, maybe who aren't now, have to find some way in their mind to reconcile the fact that they engaged in that kind of lifestyle at one point in their life. And these redemption scripts is what help people to do that. And people would say things like, well, yes, I committed a lot of crime back then, but that's not really who I was. That's not who I am, as a person. And so they would say, and now again, keep in mind, these redemption scripts and condemnation scripts, they don't necessarily reflect the truth, but these are the things that people would tell themselves to explain, to themselves, essentially, why they are the way they are. So people would say, well, the hard things I experienced in the past make me a stronger person today, and things like this that help them to, kind of in a way justify their past behavior and changing to what they are today. So again, if you're interested in that area of desistance, look up Chad Maruna's work. He's done a lot of that, and it's actually a very interesting book to read. But one of the most effective ways, when we start talking about policies now, one of the most effective ways to prevent crime is through early intervention. The thought is that if we can, prevent kids from getting involved in crime in the first place, then that's going to be much easier than trying to get them out of it, once they're in it, which kind of makes sense. So one of the things that has been done in a lot of places is parenting training, teaching people, effective practices for raising their children. There have also been intervention programs aimed at improving the cognitive development of children. And the goal of all these programs is to decrease the risk factors and increase protective factors in a child's life so that they are less likely to go down a criminal path otherwise than if they did not possess those same factors. When we talk about policy implications, one of the arguments that is advanced very frequently is the idea that incarceration only further ensnares offenders in their criminal trajectory. And there actually is a lot of support for this argument that prison and jail are really just schools of crime, and people that go there frequently come out worse than when they went in. But currently that is the form of punishment that our society uses the most frequently. But in terms of public support, there's a lot of public support for early intervention programs because we really want to get at this stuff early rather than trying to treat it on the back end. There is a lot of evidence that early intervention works. One of the most successful early intervention programs is the Head Start program. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a preschool program for disadvantaged families, and it's aimed at, again, just adding protective factors to children's lives to prevent them from going down a criminal life path. And it actually has worked pretty well. But there's also evidence that early intervention programs, aside from being effective, are also cost effective. It's much cheaper to run a pre-K program than it is to run a prison. Even though it costs some money on the front end, it's a lot less expensive than the money we'll pay on the back end if we don't use these early intervention programs. So beyond just early intervention, a lot of this LifeCourse research suggests that we need to consider strategies that are not saved as young children but persist in offending into adulthood. And one of the things that has become more and more popular in the last decade or so is reentry programs, because we have about 2 million people in our prisons and jails at any given point in time, and most of them are going to get out. Very few people serve life sentences. So at some point, almost everyone in prison now is going to be back out on the street. So giving these people the social support they need to succeed has become a big focus. When we talk about reentry, that's what we're talking about, is people coming out of prison and re-entering society successfully. And again, making sure people can get jobs and that they've got a place to live, and that they don't just fall back into their old patterns. Those kinds of things that reentry programs look at. So, LifeCourse Theory does point to the need to intervene in people's lives early so that they don't run into problems, but it also suggests that we can change people's trajectories later in life if they do end up on that path. There are a number of things we can do to try and bring them back into productive society even as adults. There have been some correctional interventions that have been based on LifeCourse Theory and LifeCourse Research. One of the things they talk about is planned change. If you have a good rehabilitation program that's designed well, you can show people how to make changes occur in their lives if they really want to do it. So you don't just kind of have to let people wander through life and hope that something happens to change them. You can actually help them plan those changes, and that's what those kinds of therapy programs have come out of some of this LifeCourse research that's been done. So to start to wrap this up a little bit, again, this is the end of the book, so just in general, criminology, you've seen over the course of this semester, is just filled with all kinds of competing theoretical ideas. And in one sense, there's kind of a competition going on to see which one is the most right, I guess, is the best way to say it. But I think people are starting to move away from this idea of competing and finding out what's most right, to just trying to figure out, what are some good ideas that work, what are some things we can do to help people move on. And, part of the richness that we have in theorizing these days is from attempts to revitalize old ideas in new ways. But there have also been, some truly new ideas that have come along. And some of the new ideas we get are not necessarily from the field of criminology. They come from people in other disciplines. Ideas from sociology and psychology, those kinds of things that bring new ideas and ideologies with them that can help us with our own theorizing. So when we look at the contemporary theories that we have, again, keep in mind that the theories that are developed are not always, it's not just random. Usually, theories are developed because of the social context of the world that we live in. And you kind of think you can see that in some respects with biological theory, that we live in a world with evolving technology, and these kinds of things are becoming more and more interesting to people, and so we see a lot of development in that area. Whereas 50 years ago you didn't see that because we just didn't really have a lot of interest in it, and we didn't have a good means to do it. So changes in technology have driven a lot of the biosocial theory. It's not necessarily that we think it's the most correct kind of theory, it just happens to be something that we're able to do now, and do it in a way that makes sense. So keep that in mind as you continue your study of criminology and as you finish up this course. It's important to be aware of all of these theories and how they work, and there are some core ideas behind all of them that kind of run through several of these theories. They all have ideas in common. But I hope you've found this book somewhat interesting and at least have broadened your knowledge of criminological theory. But if that's all I have for now, so if you have any questions about any of this, just get in touch with me, and I'll talk to you soon.